Okay, welcome. It's no secret that I love Project Runway, so I've decided to combine my two current loves, Art Through the Ages and Project Runway, for this video in order to help solidify your understanding of some of the works of art we need to know. Let's get rid of this background noise and get started. Today, I'm going to introduce you to the Great Stupa of Sanchi. Let me bring this a little bit closer. This is where we're headed in our investigation. And we're going to do it in the best of Project Runway methods. The favorite episode of Project Runway in every season is the Unconventional Materials Challenge. That means that the designers need to take materials that are not typical to the art of fashion design and use them to create fashion. So, in our parallel universe, we're going to use unconventional materials that I can find here at home in order to reconstruct a very important sacred space to Southeast Asian art. So, located in Sanchi, which is a city in what is now pretty much the center of what we call India, the terrain there would be fairly rocky. So I'm going to take a few of these rocks that I almost always have on my coffee table around some candles. And there you go. We have the setting for the Great Stupa of Sanchi. Very rocky terrain. So, as you approach the stupa, what you are going to be most visually impressed with at first, let me back up just a minute, I forgot something. The whole purpose of the video is to sort of construct the stupa, talking about its meaning, its shape, its form, so that you could eventually do both a formal analysis and a symbolic analysis of this work of art. Very likely a question you might have to answer at some point. So, as you approach the stupa, visually, you are most going to be struck by the dome-like structure. There we go, mixing bowl. Dome-like structure that is not a tomb, and yet it is housing the remnants of a life. It is a monument that holds the cremated remains of the Buddha. The Buddha lived in the 6th century BCE, and the Great Stupa at Sanchi was built at approximately the 3rd century BCE, and it's believed that there was sort of a waning of the memory of the Buddha, and these were monuments built to sort of reinvigorate that understanding or that commitment to the faith. So, the remnants of the Buddha would have been placed in 8 reliquaries, reliquaries being the word to describe the containers or vessels that held the relics. Relics might have been cremated remains of his actual body, could have also been clothing or artifacts of his life that were in contact with him, that he had actually touched and therefore were sacred. So they would have been placed inside this solid mound of rubble and earth, rock and rubble and other stuff, in the very beginning. At some point in history, it was then enclosed again with mud brick, and that's the form that we would see today. But this mound of earth, this stone monument, would have been built upon an area that included a walkway. We're going to use this very large plate to represent the circumambulatory at the Great Stupa of Sanchi. So you would have a pathway that surrounds the stupa, much like this. And that pathway was a very critical part of how the stupa was used, a very critical part of its function. Because the stupa works as a site of pilgrimage, those who practice the Buddhist tradition would make a pilgrimage to this site in order to accumulate merit. In trying to reach that state of enlightenment themselves, they would pilgrimage, they would travel to the stupa and spend time circumambulating the stupa in a clockwise direction. They would be traveling around the stupa in the same direction as the sun would move around the earth. So in the process of doing that, they were closer to the remnants of the Buddha. It wasn't just the mound, though, that was important. Because it represents sort of a sacred space, there was the intent to separate this space from the profane world, or from the rest of the world. And so atop the stupa itself, you would see a small, typically square, form or structure coming out of the top. It would be called a harmika. In this case, it is a gift box. So I place the gift box on top of the stupa. It now becomes a harmika. The harmika served as sort of a gateway between, again, as I said, the earthly world and the heavenly space. Atop this, on some occasions, you might see a fence-like structure protecting the piece I'm about to show you. Not all stupas, the great stupa at Sanchi does not have that gateway at the top, or the fence at the top. So, sitting atop the harmika, one would find what's called a yasti. The yasti is a central post meant to be symbolic of the axis of the earth, and attached to that yasti is not just a cocktail umbrella, but would be a shatra. There are 3 stone discs, apparently with different meanings. I've seen it described as being representative of royalty, and I've seen other descriptions where it just says they have different meanings depending on the site. But there would be 3 extending upward into the heavens. Again, they would be stone discs, not cocktail umbrellas. But for the unconventional materials challenge, this is the closest I could come. By scale, they are dramatically inappropriate. These would be much smaller by comparison to the more important portion. Can she do it? The more important portion is, of course, the stupa itself, but these are symbolic of the space leading to the heavens. Mine just makes it look more important because they're so large. Okay, so in addition to these parts that I have explained, there would be one more stone enclosure that would go around the walkway. So this would be intended to serve as sort of a separation of the profane world and the sacred space. And in this enclosure, there would be 4 openings, or 4 gates, and they would align with the 4 cardinal points on a compass. So on the, let's see, that would, in my house, that would be south. So there would be a gate on the south side and a gate on the north side, then a gate on the east side, and a gate on the west. For our purposes, we're only going to talk about one of the gates, and that would be the one on the northern side, where you would see, essentially, the gate. This would be called the Torana. If you were speaking about multiples of the Torana, they would be called Tori or Torii. There are 2 I's at the end of the word, T-O-R-I-I. The gateway is typically stone. Looks reminiscent, I guess, and we will find out more as we travel to Japan, but very similar to, in design, to the pagoda, to the architectural structure that is basically 2 posts and then a cross piece, which goes back to what? A post and lintel kind of system. So as you look at the Torana, there would be just the entire surface, front, back, every side of the 2 posts and of these 3 cross members would be complete relief surfaces, somewhat decorative, well, very decorative, but all very symbolic as well. On the surfaces, you might see representations of the past lives of the Buddha and of the how did they say that? I thought it was interesting. The life before the final rebirth. I guess the final rebirth would have happened, and then there was no after that, because once enlightenment had been attained, there was the end of that cycle of birth and death. So there would be representations of the past life, and there would be other important stories relayed on these cross pieces, but you would, in the very beginning, not see any physical representation of the Buddha. In the 3rd century, when this would have been constructed, that was not an appropriate thing to do. You did not represent the physical form of the Buddha, because the belief was that the Buddha's physical form no longer existed, obviously known because the remains were here, but because the enlightenment had been attained, that physical form was no longer needed. Over time, because it became more of a religion and not just the foundational beliefs, people wanted a physical form to worship. And so much later in the history of Buddhism, you start to see representations in different ways and in different progressions of iconography, but representations of the Buddha. If you were to go to the great Stupa at Sanchi, you would now see figural forms of the Buddha. I forgot to get one more unconventional material. Let me grab this guy. Shoot, I wish I could find more than one. Ooh, maybe this would work. Okay, so in corresponding to each of the gates, you might see a figural form sitting just inside the gate of the Buddha, close as I could come. Sitting along the pathway, we can have another Buddha over here. So, I think that's it. Those are the most important things to know. The circumambulatory, where the pilgrimage would be made to walk in a clockwise direction around the stupa. The stupa, which was the monument containing the relics of the Buddha. The harmika, the stone box or fence gateway separating the profane world from the sacred space. The yasti with the 3 stone discs called kshatras. The enclosure around the outside, again separating sacred space from the outside world. Torana, or tori in plural, facing each of the 4 cardinal directions. I think that's all you need to know. Do know that it's a site of pilgrimage. Here, we'll give you an up-close version of this beautiful model. I don't know if I can do this. So there's the Buddha body. All the parts. More of my living room than you really care to see. Coming back to the Torana, the rocky terrain. There we go. It's very possible you will encounter a question like name a site of pilgrimage and choose one from a non-Western tradition. The Great Stupa of Sanchi could be that element. You now would be able to explain the symbolism of it and how it was used by those of the Buddhist faith in their religious practices. That's it. Thanks for joining me.